All right, welcome back to What About Nutrition? Steve Casper in the studio, part 2 here today, talking about osteoporosis and a lot of great things. Phil Hess, our special guest in the studio again, and we have our host, David Gall, Mr. Nutrition, as I have not talked about that in the last couple of weeks.
That's right.
I have not given you that moniker recently, but here it is, Mr. Nutrition himself, David Gall of O'Fallon Nutrition. And by the way, for any type of nutritional products, supplements, whatever, O'Fallon Nutrition to me is, you can pick up these things all kinds of places and some of the big box stores as well, but you're not going to get the variety, you're not going to get the expertise, and certainly not going to get somebody that's going to be helpful and talk to you about these when you go through these big aisles in the big box stores.
Exactly.
You need. Now your folks are very well trained there.
They are very well trained, and it brings up a quick comment, Steve, regarding that. I've been seeing these TV commercials late at night for a camera store that I probably won't name, that's in St. Louis, that looks like a great operation, and the owner is always a host of these little short 15-second commercials, and the point that he always makes is he's got the best trained staff in town, and if you want to discuss high-end cameras, then they're the place to go, because you're going to get help, and that's really what we are, but for dietary supplements or herbs or aromatherapy.
Oh, yeah.
We have staff that are constantly going through training. I've been through extensive training. We have a physician on staff, Dr. Jim McDaniel, who's a chiropractic physician, has tremendous training in biochemistry. We really are different. And we are not a high-pressure sales store. We are in it for the long run. Our purpose is to educate consumers and to help them make the best choices they can regarding their natural supplements.
It's awesome. It's awesome.
So that's the sales pitch for us again today, but we really believe in it.
I'm really glad we got into that, and let's continue with osteoporosis.
That's right. So we were just discussing osteoporosis with our friend Phil Hess here before the break, and we discussed the basics of osteoporosis. It's very common. Over 50% of women over age 50 will have a fracture at some point during their lifetime. About 1 in 5 women have osteoporosis past the age of 50. So huge issue, and men, of course, can suffer from this too. So it's not just women. And we went into the calcium paradox. Too little calcium leads to brittle bone, whereas too much calcium can lead to increased cardiovascular risk. So what's just the right amount and just the right forms? And we went into some studies on that in segment 1 that you can listen to archived on our website at o'fallonnutrition.com. And then moving forward here, we discussed forms like calcium citrate and carbonate as opposed to forms that are performing even better in research, such as forms derived from red marine algae. Really important stuff there. But now we're going to transition with Phil to discussing the cofactors with calcium. And an example of this, folks, we've all heard of vitamin D, and especially its increased importance over the last few years for calcium absorption. That's an example of a cofactor. So this idea that it's not just calcium, there are other nutrients required. This is a symphony. You can have somebody play a violin solo, and that sounds wonderful, but it's not the same as the entire symphony with all the instruments coming together. It's a completely different animal at that point. And that analogy is true about nutrition as well. Calcium here is the star of the show, but we need supporting role players to come along for the ride with it. So with that, Phil, let's talk about vitamin K2 and its importance with calcium.
Yes, it's a very nice analogy there, Dave. Wonderful. Thanks. Well, vitamin K2, it's really not that well understood, basically, by the medical community. Mm-hmm. The medical community is very aware of vitamin K1, but there's vitamin K1 and vitamin K2.
Sure.
The role vitamin K1 plays, we know, is in clotting. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
But K2 plays a different role in the body's ability to form and build bone. What vitamin K2 does is active. On the one hand, it activates osteocalcin inside your bone, and once activated, the osteocalcin works with the osteoblasts to help weave calcium, phosphorus, and a dozen other trace minerals that are important in bone production.
So the body actually kind of weaves these minerals together. That's a great explanation.
Yes, it does, and it uses K2 to activate the protein that's necessary for that to be done.
Wow.
Furthermore, what it does, and another thing that vitamin K2, it's really an exciting vitamin, is that it prevents the buildup of calcium in your arteries. Mm-hmm. And it does this by activating a protein in your body, in your blood vessel wall, actually, known as matrix GLA protein.
Okay.
Once that protein is activated, it will literally leach out calcium from the blood vessel wall and then puts it into the bloodstream. and then it'll travel to the bone where osteocalcin, the calcium would be uptaken by the bone, by the osteoblasts to actually build bone.
Wow, that makes perfect sense. So that's really interesting. That enzyme that you just mentioned, was it matrix GLA? Was
Yes.
that correct? Okay, so the vitamin K2 activates this enzyme known as matrix GLA, and it can actually, in studies on, I believe it's certain animals such as rats, it reverses calcification of the arteries in those studies as a result of this matrix GLA. And then that releases calcium into the bloodstream, where, as just a cool side note, I have to assume must become available for bone at that point after it comes out of the arteries.
Absolutely,
Wow.
especially if there's enough vitamin K2 on board.
Enough to release enough of the calcium.
Yes, and you make an interesting point about the animal model that you talked about earlier, and that's a fascinating trial, because what they basically did was, interestingly, they wanted to see if the vitamin K2 can actually literally leach out calcium from the arteries and thus make the arteries much more distensible, bendable, and pliable. Right?
Softer arteries.
Right. So what they did was they actually gave these animals, these rats, if you will, Coumadin and warfarin, because Coumadin works by inhibiting vitamin K1, and ultimately K2. So they gave the rats enough Coumadin to get their arteries hard, but not enough to kill them.
So the point here, first point, is that they used Coumadin in this study on rats to create calcified arteries in the rats.
Yes, indeed. And that's
Wow.
the way it's done in the laboratory.
So that's just the standard method to calcify arteries in an animal.
Yes.
Okay, and then what happened?
Well, they then gave vitamin K2 to see if they could leach out the calcium that was deposited. And indeed it did. After, I think, 6 weeks, they had a reduction of roughly 36% of the calcium was actually leached out.
Wow.
So they're doing, there's a 250 patient human trial ongoing right now in Europe to see if vitamin K2 can actually decalcify in large human trials.
So it's been shown to be possible in animals such as rats, and right now in Europe there's studies looking into whether that will hold true for humans.
Absolutely.
I see. Very interesting. So we've actually got this situation where vitamin K2 has been shown in studies of rats to decalcify the arteries, and what you and I are trying to talk about with K2 is K2's ability to support calcium going to the right places in the body rather than simply being stored in the arteries or stored in the kidneys.
That's correct. That's correct. We talked earlier about the one thing about the study where they
We're going to
demonstrated
have to take you to the store after this, Steve.
Well, I need that.
Elderberry zinc lozenges, right?
Yeah.
The one thing we talked about earlier was the calcium citrate and how it caused hardening of the arteries. Well, it's important to note in that trial there was no K2 cofactor in that trial. The patients in that study were just getting calcium citrate without K2. Had vitamin K2 been used in that study, the outcome would have been totally different, I'm sure, because the K2 would have protected the buildup of the calcium in the
So
artery.
you're referring to a study where they only gave folks calcium citrate, and that was a study we talked about in the first segment, and I just want to bring it up for folks that didn't hear that. In this study, they gave folks only calcium citrate. They expected to find a reduction in cardiovascular risk, and unfortunately, they found the opposite, an increase in cardiovascular risk as a result of supplementing with calcium citrate by itself.
Yes, I
And
think.
so now we're talking about doing that with vitamin K2, and what would the difference be?
Well, the difference would be significant. In fact, New Chapter, the company I work for, and other companies have followed suit. A lot of companies in the supplement business really are recognizing the importance of vitamin K2.
Sure.
And many of us have formulated our bone building products with that critical compound, with that critical vitamin K2. So bone building is a very complex, process, if
Sure.
you will.
Of course.
And it requires so many different things. And we at New Chapter believe, first, in doing no harm. So
Okay.
we formulated a product that we make with a form of calcium that has 80% bioavailability, and it's plant sourced. We've got vitamin D3, which we all know helps with the increase with the bioavailability of calcium.
Sure.
But moreover, I think the addition of vitamin K2 actually does two things. It builds bone and protects the arteries. And that's why it's such an important formulation.
And we're saying this based on studies where, in terms of protecting the arteries, we have this rat model where it reduces the calcification of the arteries, and we have the ongoing human study in Europe taking place right now. Results will be released in the future. And then we also have studies that show that vitamin K2 helps the enzymes like osteocalcin weave the minerals, calcium, and other cofactor minerals together into the actual bone matrix.
Yes, it does.
So we got science to back this up.
There's great science to back this up. And vitamin K2, if the next 18 months, 2 years will be, is going to be much more recognized for its health value than it is today. But already in the naturals business is much ahead of the medical community in terms of taking advantage of the available science and making these products available to people.
Yeah, and we should comment that this, I don't believe we brought up that this K2 research came about as a result of folks noticing that certain Japanese folks who consume a breakfast food known as natto, which is naturally very, very high in K2, were having some remarkable outcomes in terms of osteoporosis and cardiovascular health. And so I believe that's what spurred the research into vitamin K2, was noticing how healthy folks that consume natto are.
Yes, indeed. And you'll notice Asian populations, their rates of osteoporosis are much, much lower.
And they consume a lot less dairy than we do.
Yes, but they eat a lot of natto. It's a fermented soy product that is probably the world's richest food source of vitamin K2.
Of course, and they also do a lot more green vegetables in general than we do as well. So they've got this natto with the K2, and they've got this great plant source calcium coming in the form of green vegetables. So as well as I should comment, a little bit of fat in the diet, which is important for calcium absorption. So all you folks out there drinking skim milk because it's quote unquote good for you may want to consider whether you would like a little fat with your calcium. I suggest you Google that. So Phil, we got to wrap it up. We've got about 30 seconds to go here, and I think this has been an incredibly awesome show. I think we've really helped inform people of some critical issues they should be aware of regarding their calcium and getting certain cofactors in what form. Is it from a plant source or is it from a rock? And I think it's just really fascinating. Of course, New Chapter makes a product called Bone Strength Take Care that happens to, in our opinion, do all the right things in terms of its formula going. So with that, Steve, I guess let's wrap up this awesome show today.
Well, thank you, Phil, and thank you, David. What a great show. So pleased to have this on Westplex Broadcasting, all about nutrition. What about nutrition? Steve Casper, also your co-host. And just have a great rest of the day, and join us next time when it's time for What About Nutrition? And, of course, O'Fallon Nutrition, located in O'Fallon, Missouri. And you can always check them out on the web at www.o'fallonnutrition.com, and you'll find these shows archived there so you can listen to them, o'fallonnutrition.com. See you next time. Bye-bye.